Phước Tuy Province, 1967. Four Australian infantrymen spot movement through thick jungle, black pajamas, conical hats, AK-47 silhouettes. Fingers tighten on triggers. 3 pounds of pressure from opening fire. Then, a hand signal. Recognition code. They're not Viet Cong, they're Australian SAS. Wearing the enemy's clothes, deep in enemy territory, and even their own troops can't tell the difference. The jungle at dawn is never silent. Insects hum in frequencies that pierce eardrums. Birds call warnings across canopies. Leaves drip with humidity that soaks through everything. In this cacophony, the Australian infantry patrol moves carefully through Phước Tuy Province, eyes scanning tree lines, fingers resting on trigger guards. They're 3 kilometers from base, sweeping a suspected Viet Cong infiltration route. Standard operation, routine patrol, until it isn't. The point man freezes. Hand signal, 4 figures, 50 meters ahead, moving perpendicular across their path. Black pajamas hanging loose on frames, conical hats bobbing with movement. The distinctive silhouette of AK-47 rifles. Every Australian weapon swings toward the targets. Safeties click off. The patrol leader's finger tightens on his L1A1 rifle trigger. 3 pounds of pressure stand between those 4 figures and death. The math is simple. 4 targets, 6 rifles, overlapping fields of fire. They won't survive the first volley. Then one of the figures raises a hand, not in surrender. In signal, the specific pattern taught in briefings, the recognition code that should have been radioed before dawn. The patrol leader's breath catches. His finger eases off the trigger. The figures approach, and faces become visible under those conical hats. White faces. Australian faces. SAS operators returning from a 2-week reconnaissance mission deep in enemy territory, wearing Viet Cong clothing, carrying captured weapons, looking exactly like the enemy they'd been hunting. The patrol leader's anger arrives after his adrenaline fades. His men nearly killed friendlies. The SAS team leader shrugs. They filed their mission plan. Someone should have briefed the patrol. The radio chatter that follows is tense. Recriminations. Blame. But underneath it all, a question neither side voices. Why would Australia's elite soldiers risk being killed by their own troops? What possible advantage justifies making yourself indistinguishable from the enemy? The answer to that question reveals everything about how a small contingent of Australian commandos changed the nature of jungle warfare in Vietnam. The American way of war in Vietnam was loud by design. Helicopters announced their arrival from miles away, rotors thumping bass notes through valleys. Artillery softened landing zones with explosions that registered on seismographs. Once on ground, operations moved like industrial machinery. Companies of 100-plus soldiers crashed through undergrowth. Radios crackled constantly with traffic. Supply convoys rumbled along roads. At night, defensive perimeters blazed with lights and generators hummed. The doctrine was search and destroy. Find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them with overwhelming firepower. It seemed logical. It had worked in World War II. It had worked in Korea. Massive firepower applied against concentrated enemy forces delivered victory. Except in Vietnam, the enemy refused to concentrate. The Viet Cong heard American operations coming from 5 miles away. The helicopter insertion itself announced exactly where Americans would be. The VC simply melted away, into villages where they blended with civilians, into tunnel systems that honeycombed the earth, into jungle so thick that 5 feet of visibility was normal. They waited until Americans departed, then reappeared like water flowing back into a depression. American units would sweep an area, encounter nothing, declare it clear, and leave. Within hours, the VC controlled it again. The frustration mounted as 1966 became 1967. Ammunition expenditure was astronomical. Actual enemy contacts were rare. When they happened, the VC chose the time and place, hitting American positions and vanishing before reinforcements arrived. At distances beyond 50 meters, American uniforms were unmistakable. The distinctive camouflage pattern, the helmet silhouette, the bulk of equipment. The VC could identify American positions long before Americans spotted them. The jungle rewarded invisibility, not firepower. And the Americans, despite their technological superiority, were highly visible. But the Australians arrived with different knowledge. Between 1948 and 1960, they'd fought communist insurgents during the Malayan Emergency. 12 years of jungle warfare against the Malayan National Liberation Army. They'd learned from British counterinsurgency experts who understood that fighting communists in jungle terrain required patience, stealth, and adaptation. Small unit tactics replaced large sweeps. Silent movement replaced mechanical noise. Cultural understanding replaced firepower. The Australians learned to read jungle signs, broken twigs, disturbed earth, the absence of normal sounds. They developed negative tracking, the art of searching for things that weren't there. Spiderwebs rebuilt across paths. Leaves carefully replaced. The subtle signs that someone had passed and tried to hide it. In 1962, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk admitted publicly that American forces knew little about jungle warfare. The admission was stark. The United States military, the most powerful in history, was unprepared for this environment. When Australian advisors arrived in Vietnam in 1962, followed by combat units in 1965, they brought 12 years of hard-won jungle expertise. Their tactical philosophy was completely different. Where Americans sought to dominate terrain with bases and firepower, Australians sought to become part of the terrain itself. Where Americans moved in large visible units, Australians operated in small invisible teams. Where Americans relied on technology, Australians relied on fieldcraft. The difference would prove decisive. The Special Air Service Regiment represented the apex of Australian military capability. Formed in 1957 and modeled on the British SAS, the regiment selected candidates through brutal testing that eliminated 90% of applicants. Those who survived trained at Swanbourne in Western Australia, learning advanced reconnaissance, survival, and combat skills. When they deployed to Vietnam in 1966, they numbered around 100 operators rotating through tours. They established themselves at Nui Dat Base in Phước Tuy Province, the Australian area of operations southeast of Saigon. Their mission profile was distinct from regular infantry. They weren't there to hold ground or conduct sweeps. They were there to find the enemy and provide intelligence for strikes. A standard SAS reconnaissance patrol consisted of 4 to 5 men. American long-range reconnaissance patrols typically fielded 6 to 12. The Australians believed smaller teams moved more quietly and presented less signature. These patrols would insert by helicopter at dusk, move several kilometers from the landing zone, and operate for 7 to 14 days deep in Viet Cong-controlled territory. Their objectives were intelligence-driven. Map enemy movements and base camps, identify supply routes and cache sites, locate high-value targets for artillery or airstrikes. When opportunity arose, conduct prisoner snatch operations. They operated 10 to 20 kilometers from friendly lines with no possibility of quick extraction if compromised. Radio silence was maintained except for scheduled check-ins. If they were detected, they would have to evade and escape on foot through hostile territory. The mission demanded absolute stealth. The problem they faced was fundamental. They were operating in areas the Viet Cong controlled completely. Villages served as VC support bases. Every civilian was a potential informant. Trails were watched. Unusual sounds investigated. The VC knew their territory intimately and could detect intrusions. Traditional military uniforms made stealth nearly impossible. The Australian disruptive pattern camouflage, while effective at distance, was still recognizably military and Western up close. Equipment was metal and reflective. Movement patterns were recognizably Western. Body language differed from Vietnamese locals. At ranges under 50 meters, there was no mistaking Australian soldiers for anything else. This created an impossible challenge. To gather intelligence, they needed to get close to enemy positions, but getting close meant being identified. Being identified meant being compromised. Being compromised meant being killed or captured. Initial operations used standard camouflage techniques, face paint in greens and blacks, foliage attached to uniforms and equipment, slow methodical movement, but several early patrols were compromised despite these precautions. VC sentries spotted them. Searches were launched. The SAS teams escaped through skill and luck, but the margin was razor thin. After-action reviews identified the core issue. At close range, they were obviously Western soldiers regardless of camouflage, the shape of equipment, the outline of helmets, the color of skin, the way they moved. Everything marked them as foreign. They needed something more radical than camouflage. They needed to become visually indistinguishable from the enemy. The proposal emerged from SAS commanders studying captured Viet Cong equipment and clothing. What if reconnaissance teams wore enemy clothing on operations? The idea was immediately controversial. International laws of war addressed combatants wearing enemy uniforms. The Hague Conventions defined it as perfidy in certain contexts. Captured soldiers in enemy uniforms could be treated as spies and executed rather than granted prisoner of war protections. There were identification concerns. How would friendly forces distinguish disguised SAS from actual VC? The potential for friendly fire was enormous. Australian headquarters debated the proposal intensely. Legal officers raised objections. Tactical officers argued operational necessity. Intelligence officers pointed out the VC did it routinely, wearing captured American and South Vietnamese uniforms. The argument that prevailed was survival. SAS patrols operating deep in enemy territory needed every advantage. If wearing VC clothing increased their stealth and survivability, the risk was justified. The decision was made. Reconnaissance teams would be authorized to wear captured enemy clothing on operations. Strict protocols were established. All units would be briefed when SAS operated in their areas. Recognition signals would be standardized. Radio procedures would be explicit. The legal justification was that the clothing was for reconnaissance and concealment, not for engaging in combat while disguised. In practice, the lines would blur, but the authorization was given. The clothing itself was carefully sourced. Black or dark blue pajamas, the traditional Vietnamese peasant clothing that the Viet Cong wore universally. Loose-fitting shirt and trousers that allowed movement and ventilation in tropical heat. The clothing was captured from dead VC, taken from prisoners, or sometimes supplied by South Vietnamese intelligence services. Authenticity mattered because the VC clothing varied slightly by region. Wrong clothing could mark the wearer as outsider as surely as a Western uniform. Ho Chi Minh sandals were essential, made from tire rubber soles with inner tube straps. They were the standard VC footwear. They were silent on trails and left distinctive tread marks that looked indigenous. Conical hats, the non-la, were worn when approaching villages or moving through open areas where hat silhouettes mattered. Sometimes VC webbing and chest rigs were worn over the pajamas, holding ammunition and equipment. The weapons mix was critical. Captured AK-47 rifles were carried openly. At distance, the distinctive profile of the Kalashnikov marked the carrier as VC or NVA, but concealed beneath clothing or in packs. The SAS operators carried suppressed Western weapons. The L1A1 rifle with suppressor, the CAR-15 shortened M16 variant, suppressed pistols. If they needed to engage quietly, Western weapons offered accuracy and reliability. If they needed to appear Vietnamese, the AK was displayed. Critical Western equipment couldn't be abandoned. Radios for communication, medical supplies for trauma, maps and compasses for navigation, emergency signaling devices for air extraction. These were hidden in specially modified pockets or packs that looked like VC equipment from outside, but held modern Western technology inside. Managing appearance required constant attention. Skin exposure was minimized during operations. Darker tans helped, but Australian operators could never pass as Asian at close range. Facial features remained the critical giveaway. The solution was to operate at distances where faces weren't clearly visible and avoid close contact with civilians. Movement speed and patterns were studied and practiced. Vietnamese walked differently than Westerners. The gait, the posture, the way weight shifted. SAS operators spent hours practicing indigenous movement patterns until they became unconscious. Body language was rehearsed. The way VC soldiers carried weapons, how they gestured to each other, the posture when resting. Every detail mattered because human brains are pattern recognition machines. Something slightly wrong triggers alarm. The visual deception operated on distance thresholds. At ranges beyond 100 meters, properly disguised SAS operators were completely indistinguishable from Viet Cong. The silhouette matched. The clothing pattern matched. The color palette blended perfectly with the environment. Between 50 and 100 meters, the disguise still held. The outline and movement patterns read as indigenous. Observers saw what they expected to see, their own forces. Between 25 and 50 meters, the deception became fragile. Body language and movement patterns became critical. Any Western mannerism could trigger suspicion. Under 25 meters was the danger zone. Facial features became visible, skin tone differences apparent. Accents would be recognized. At this range, the SAS avoided contact unless absolutely necessary or in prepared ambush positions. The operational advantages became clear immediately. Village reconnaissance transformed. SAS teams could approach village perimeters in early morning or dusk. VC sentries scanning the tree line saw figures in black pajamas and conical hats. Friendlies. No alarm was raised. This bought crucial minutes of observation time. The SAS could map defensive positions, count personnel, identify leaders, note weapons and equipment. They could plant listening devices near meeting areas. They could sketch detailed diagrams of village layouts. Then they would withdraw before close contact forced recognition. The intelligence gathered was phenomenally detailed compared to distant observation or aerial reconnaissance. Trail watching operations became vastly more effective. The VC moved supplies and personnel along jungle trails that were invisible from the air and difficult for large patrols to watch without detection. SAS teams would establish observation posts overlooking key trails. If they were briefly spotted by VC scouts, the scouts saw black pajama-clad figures and assumed they were friendly forces pulling security. No alarm was raised. VC columns continued normal operations, moving supplies, rotating troops, using the trails as they always had. The SAS gathered detailed intelligence on logistics patterns, personnel numbers, equipment types, and timing. This intelligence was radioed to artillery units and tactical air controllers. Strikes could be planned with precision. The VC never understood how Australians seemed to know exactly when and where they would be moving. Ambush positioning reached new levels of lethality. Traditional ambushes required finding a good position along an enemy route and hoping the enemy used that route at the right time. But the SAS could infiltrate to ideal ambush positions while appearing to be VC forces. When enemy scouts passed by on point, they saw what looked like their own forces in position, perhaps providing security or resting. No alarm was raised. The main VC column would continue forward, entering the kill zone completely unsuspecting. When the ambush was triggered, the surprise was absolute. The VC hadn't just failed to detect an ambush. They had seen it and not recognized it. Prisoner snatch operations exploited the deception ruthlessly. Capturing enemy personnel for interrogation was high priority, but snatches were extremely difficult. They required getting close enough to grab an isolated individual and extract before reinforcements arrived. The disguise made it possible. SAS teams could approach VC rest areas or way stations. They could move through the periphery until they identified an isolated individual. The snatch would be lightning quick. Grab the target, gag and bind them, move. The crucial seconds after the snatch were where the disguise paid off. Other VC in the area saw black pajama-clad figures moving quickly. In the confusion, they hesitated to fire, uncertain if they were shooting at their own forces. That hesitation gave the SAS extraction time they wouldn't have had in Australian uniforms. Emergency evasion scenarios became survivable. If a patrol was compromised and enemy forces were sweeping the area, the disguise became a life-saving asset. The SAS team would break contact and move rapidly through a different vector. VC search teams looking for Western invaders would pass groups in black pajamas without close inspection. The searchers were looking for Australian uniforms, not VC clothing. Several patrols survived compromises specifically because they blended into the human terrain. They moved through areas where VC units were actively searching for them and were not recognized because they looked like they belonged. The integration with negative tracking techniques multiplied effectiveness. The VC had become expert at concealing their movements through jungle. They would restore undergrowth after passing, replace leaves, rebuild spider webs across paths, create false trails. The obvious signs of passage were eliminated, but there were always subtle tells. A leaf placed upside down, a spider web rebuilt, but without the radial symmetry, earth disturbed and smoothed, but still showing compression patterns. SAS operators trained extensively in detecting these negative indicators, but they also needed to pass through areas without leaving these indicators themselves. The VC clothing reduced their overall signature. Combined with fieldcraft and the tracking skills, they achieved near-invisible movement. They could operate in the same terrain as the VC, moving through the same trails and base areas without being detected. They had become ghosts. But the tactical advantage extended beyond mere concealment. The psychological impact on the Viet Cong became a weapon in itself. SAS commanders recognized this quickly and began deliberately exploiting it. The operations weren't just about gathering intelligence anymore. They were about getting inside the enemy's mind, creating doubt, breeding paranoia, weaponizing fear. The techniques they developed would be studied by special operations forces for decades after. The ghost operations were brilliantly simple. After observing a VC base camp or rest area, the SAS would leave subtle evidence of their presence before departing. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would immediately alert sentries, but items slightly moved from their original positions. Food supplies touched but not taken. Cigarettes stubbed out in fire pits that had been cold. Sleeping areas disturbed but nothing stolen. The signs were ambiguous. Could be animals. Could be wind. Could be carelessness. But when VC units returned to these locations and noticed these details, doubt crept in. Someone had been here. Someone who knew where things were. Someone who had access. The question was terrifying. Were they one of us? The reports that filtered back through intelligence channels showed the psychological impact. VC units began suspecting their own members. Accusations were made. Security crackdowns implemented. The phrase "wearing our clothes" became associated with terror. If the Australians could dress like them and move among them undetected, then who could be trusted? Internal cohesion suffered. Units that had operated smoothly began experiencing friction and suspicion. VC commanders ordered increased identity verification procedures, challenges and countersigns, inspection of documents. The time and effort spent on these security measures slowed operational tempo. The Australians were imposing costs without firing a shot. Certain geographical areas became psychologically tainted. The VC started avoiding zones where these phantom encounters had occurred. Trail networks were rerouted. Base camps relocated. Supply caches moved to different areas. Australian intelligence analysts noticed the pattern. Areas where SAS had operated intensively showed decreased enemy activity even after the SAS departed. The zones had become haunted in the minds of VC fighters. Superstition and real fear blended together. These became known as ghost zones. The Australians had achieved territory denial through psychological pressure rather than physical presence. It was counterinsurgency at a level the Americans hadn't imagined. The reputation built through Vietnamese civilian populations as well. Villagers heard stories from VC fighters, whispered tales of Ma Yuk, Australian ghosts who walked among people unseen. Folk tales merged with operational reality. Cultural fear was weaponized. VC recruitment in Phước Tuy Province became more difficult. Young men were less willing to join units operating in areas where phantoms hunted. The psychological operations complemented the kinetic operations perfectly. The SAS was fighting on multiple levels simultaneously: physical, informational, and psychological. Captured VC documents confirmed the impact. After-action reports mentioned phantom encounters. Warnings were issued about Australian sectors. Orders circulated to avoid certain areas or maintain higher alert status. The irony was that maintaining higher alert status led to exhaustion. Units can't stay at peak readiness indefinitely. The human nervous system can't sustain constant vigilance. VC fighters in Australian areas of operation were burning out faster than those facing American units. Their effectiveness decreased. Mistakes multiplied. The psychological pressure was measurable in reduced operational capability. American intelligence officers noticed the pattern and requested briefings on Australian methods. Why did VC units behave differently in Australian sectors? Why were they more cautious, less aggressive, seemingly more fearful? The explanations fascinated American commanders. Some U.S. Special Operations Forces, particularly Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, began adopting similar techniques. SOG teams running cross-border operations into Laos and Cambodia started wearing VC and North Vietnamese Army clothing. The results were mixed. American operators struggled with aspects that came naturally to Australians. Cultural and training differences limited effectiveness. Americans tended to be larger physically, making the disguise less convincing. Body language was harder to modify. Language skills were limited. But the concept was validated even by partial success. Yet this weapon, as effective as it was, cut both ways with terrifying sharpness. The friendly fire danger was constant and acute. Every moment an SAS team spent in VC clothing near friendly forces was a moment away from catastrophe. The incidents mounted. Australian infantry patrols encountering SAS teams nearly opened fire multiple times. American units, less familiar with Australian procedures and operating on hair triggers, did open fire. Fortunately, most were warning shots or poorly aimed opening rounds that allowed the SAS to identify themselves before full contact. South Vietnamese ARVN forces were especially trigger-happy, with multiple documented incidents of fire exchanged before recognition. The near misses were traumatic. An SAS patrol returning from a 2-week mission would approach Australian defensive perimeters at night. Sentries would spot figures moving in VC clothing. The challenge would be shouted. The SAS would respond, but in darkness and tension, accents and languages became unclear. Split-second decisions had to be made. Some sentries fired warning shots, some fired for effect. The SAS operators would hit the ground desperately trying to radio their identity while bullets snapped overhead. The anger that followed these incidents was intense. Why hadn't the SAS team coordinated better? Why hadn't the sentry been properly briefed? Recriminations flew. But ultimately, everyone understood the core problem. Human instinct and training said that enemy clothing equals enemy. Overriding that instinct required conscious thought. In combat, conscious thought happens slowly. The protocol requirements became elaborate to the point of cumbersome. Before any SAS mission, detailed coordination was filed with headquarters. All units in the operational area were briefed that SAS was operating in Sector X from date Y to date Z. Recognition signals were established. Specific hand patterns, colored smoke, signal panels, radio frequencies, and code words were distributed. But the problem was that in the chaos of actual contact, protocols were forgotten. Adrenaline overrides procedure. Training takes over. And training said that people in VC clothing are targets. The SAS had to layer redundant safeguards, pre-coordinated movement corridors, radio check-ins before approaching friendly positions. In some cases, they would change back into Australian uniforms before extraction, hiding the VC clothing. But this wasn't always possible or safe. The operational restrictions imposed by friendly fire danger limited tactical flexibility. SAS teams couldn't move freely through areas occupied by friendly forces while in disguise. They had to either avoid those areas entirely, taking longer and more dangerous routes, or coordinate extensively before transiting. Sometimes the coordination itself was dangerous. Radio traffic could be intercepted. Too much communication revealed patterns. The SAS was caught between the need to deceive the enemy and the need to identify themselves to friendlies. It was an impossible balance that was maintained through constant vigilance and accepting elevated risk. The psychological burden on the operators was immense in ways that only became clear after the war. Living for weeks in enemy identity created cognitive dissonance that was difficult to process. Some operators reported dreams where their own identity became unclear, nightmares where they couldn't remember which side they were on. The hypervigilance required was exhausting beyond normal combat stress. They weren't just watching for enemy. They were watching for friendly forces who might kill them. 360-degree threat awareness every moment. The trust that normally exists between soldiers evaporated. You couldn't trust uniforms because you were wearing the wrong one. You couldn't trust familiarity because you looked like the enemy. The isolation was absolute even by special operations standards. Post-traumatic stress disorder rates in these units were measurably higher than conventional forces. Communication breakdowns created nightmares. If a patrol's radio failed in the field and they needed emergency extraction, they had a catastrophic problem. They would move to a landing zone and signal for pickup. Helicopter crews approaching would see figures in VC clothing at the LZ. Pilots would refuse to land. Gunners would open fire. The SAS would desperately signal with panels and smoke, but in the chaos of extraction under possible enemy fire, those signals might not be recognized. Several documented cases exist of extraction delays specifically because helicopter crews believed they were flying into a trap. Some patrols were compromised because they couldn't risk staying in position while friendly helicopters refused to extract them. The situation was almost farcical, except that it was lethal. The legal and ethical questions haunted operations. International humanitarian law, specifically the Hague Conventions, addressed perfidy, deception that invites enemy confidence in protected status. Wearing enemy uniforms to engage in attacks was explicitly prohibited. Captured combatants who violated these rules could be denied prisoner of war protections and treated as unlawful combatants, which in practice meant execution. Australian legal officers worried about this constantly. The justification they developed was that the disguise was for reconnaissance and concealment, not for offensive action. In theory, SAS teams would remove the disguise before conducting planned ambushes. In practice, reality was messier. Several ambushes were conducted while operators were still in VC clothing, because tactical situations evolved faster than uniform changes. The after-action reports on these incidents were classified and remain so. The capture scenario was understood and accepted by every SAS operator who wore VC clothing. If they were captured in enemy uniform, their treatment would be brutal beyond normal prisoner abuse. Geneva Convention protections wouldn't apply. The VC would treat them as spies. Torture would be extensive. Execution was certain. The operators accepted this risk knowingly. It was part of the calculation. The tactical advantage was worth the increased danger if captured. But it added another layer of stress. They weren't just trying to avoid being killed in combat. They were trying to avoid capture, which was in some ways worse. The rules of engagement became extremely complex. When could an SAS operator fire their weapon while wearing VC clothing? The official ROE specified only if compromised or in immediate self-defense. Direct combat while appearing to be VC was prohibited. Before conducting planned ambushes, they were supposed to shed the disguise or make their identity clear. But tactical realities made this impossible in many situations. An ambush might be hastily set up when opportunity arose. There was no time to change clothing. The patrol would conduct the ambush in VC uniforms and justify it post-mission as defensive action when compromise was imminent. The line between reconnaissance and combat blurred constantly. Headquarters understood this, but maintained the official position that disguises were for concealment only. It was legal fiction that protected everyone. But despite all the risks, despite the friendly fire danger and legal gray zones and psychological burdens, the results validated everything. The tactical success metrics were overwhelming. SAS reconnaissance reports increased dramatically in quality and detail. Base camp locations were precise, down to individual structure positions. Supply routes were mapped comprehensively with timing patterns that allowed prediction of future movements. Personnel counts were accurate, where previously they'd been estimates. VC organizational structures were identified through observation. Equipment types and capabilities were cataloged. The intelligence drove kinetic operations with unprecedented precision. Artillery strike effectiveness increased measurably in Australian areas of operation. When SAS provided targeting data, strikes hit actual enemy positions rather than suspected locations. The kill ratios per artillery mission increased. Ammunition was used efficiently rather than being expended on area bombardment. Tactical air support became surgical. Pilots trusted Australian targeting because SAS teams had eyes on targets. The combination of precise intelligence and responsive fire support created devastating effects on VC operations in Phước Tuy Province. The contact statistics told the story. When SAS patrols initiated contacts, their kill ratios were exceptional. They were engaging from ambush positions with complete surprise. When VC forces initiated contacts against SAS patrols, the frequency was extraordinarily rare. The SAS was detecting VC presence and evading or positioning for ambush before the VC detected them. Compared to conventional reconnaissance patrols that had regular enemy-initiated contacts, the SAS was operating in a different category of stealth. When they were detected, it was usually because they'd already established ambush positions that allowed them to control the engagement. Survival rates were higher than any comparable reconnaissance unit. Prisoner snatch operations provided a continuous flow of intelligence. The captured VC were valuable sources. Under interrogation, they revealed not just tactical information but psychological insights. They confirmed that VC forces feared the ghost soldiers. They described the paranoia in their units. They explained route changes and operational modifications made specifically to avoid Australian sectors. The prisoners validated that the psychological operations were working exactly as intended. The fear was real and measurable in changed enemy behavior. The strategic impact on Phước Tuy Province was significant. The province was Australian responsibility, assigned when they deployed in 1965. VC activity in the province measurably decreased between 1967 and 1970. Route 15, a major VC supply line running through the province, was interdicted so effectively that the VC had to develop alternative routes that were longer and less efficient. Villages that had supported VC operations became less cooperative as Australian presence became more effective. This wasn't solely because of the SAS, but they were a significant factor in creating conditions where the VC couldn't operate freely. VC behavioral changes were documented in captured orders and reports. Supply routes were explicitly shifted to avoid Australian patrol areas. Units were ordered to maintain higher alert postures when operating in Phước Tuy. The higher alert meant increased exhaustion and reduced effectiveness. Unit morale problems appeared in VC documents from the province. Recruitment became more difficult. The VC were losing control of a province they dominated before Australian arrival. The disproportionate impact was notable. Australia fielded roughly 8,000 personnel at peak deployment. The United States fielded over 500,000. Yet Australian success in their area of operations was comparable or superior when adjusted for force size. The kill ratios were better. The casualty rates were lower. The mission success rates were higher. Something different was working. American Special Operations took notice and attempted adoption. SOG, running classified cross-border operations, studied Australian methods intensively. Some SOG teams, particularly those running prairie fire missions into Laos, began wearing VC and NVA clothing. The results were mixed but positive enough to validate the concept. American operators faced challenges Australians didn't. Physical size was a factor. Americans tended to be larger than Vietnamese, making the disguise less convincing. Cultural barriers were significant. Body language and movement patterns were harder to modify without the cultural immersion Australians had gained in Malaya. Language limitations meant Americans couldn't interact even briefly without revealing themselves. But even with these limitations, SOG teams found the disguise valuable for initial concealment and psychological impact. The adoption by American forces validated the Australian innovation. The broader lesson transcended specific tactics. Conventional military doctrine had failed in Vietnam because it was designed for industrial warfare. The American military had prepared to fight World War II again, or Korea again. Massive formations, overwhelming firepower, technological superiority, attrition warfare. But Vietnam wasn't that war. The enemy was fluid, dispersed, hidden among civilians. They controlled timing and location of engagements. They used terrain and culture as weapons. Conventional responses were ineffective. The Australians succeeded because they rejected conventional wisdom. They understood that understanding the enemy mattered more than having superior technology. That cultural adaptation mattered more than firepower. That patience mattered more than aggression. The counterinsurgency principles that emerged from Australian operations in Vietnam became foundational to modern doctrine. Population-centric warfare that focused on civilians as the center of gravity rather than enemy forces. Environmental blending that made forces part of the landscape rather than imposing on it. Intelligence-driven operations that targeted specific threats rather than conducting area sweeps. Small footprint with high impact that achieved objectives without massive presence. These principles were eventually codified in American doctrine, but too late for Vietnam. The lessons were learned, but not in time to change the outcome of the war. The philosophical shift was profound. In unconventional conflicts where identity is fluid and the enemy looks like civilians, the side that controls perception holds the advantage. Willingness to abandon traditional military identity creates tactical edges. Comfort with ambiguity becomes a survival trait. Rigid adherence to conventional military appearance and doctrine becomes a death sentence. The Australians understood this intuitively from their Malaya experience. They brought that understanding to Vietnam and proved it worked. The SAS operators who wore enemy clothing were embodying this philosophy. They were proving that warfare is as much about perception as it is about kinetics. The post-Vietnam evolution of these tactics continued. Modern special operations forces worldwide adopted identity deception as core tradecraft. In Afghanistan, special operations forces routinely wore local clothing on operations. Growing beards and adopting local appearance became standard for units working with indigenous forces. In Iraq, blending operations allowed special operations to move through cities without obvious Western military presence. Every conflict since Vietnam has seen application of lessons the Australian SAS proved in Southeast Asian jungles. The techniques are now standard special operations tradecraft, taught in courses and refined through decades of application. The Australian SASR legacy was cemented by Vietnam. The regiment is regarded globally as a Tier 1 special operations unit, equivalent to American Delta Force and British SAS. The Vietnam experience is foundational to unit culture and training. The training pipeline emphasizes adaptability above all else. Cultural preparation is intensive, with operators expected to understand and blend into foreign environments. The chameleon philosophy is institutionalized. New operators learn the history of their Vietnam predecessors, who proved that survival and mission success required becoming part of the environment rather than imposing upon it. Return now to that patrol in 1967. 4 figures in black pajamas and conical hats moving through Phước Tuy Province jungle. Australian infantrymen with fingers on triggers, seconds from opening fire. The recognition signal given at the last possible moment. The anger and confusion afterward. Those 4 figures weren't just wearing disguises for tactical advantage. They were embodying an entire philosophy of warfare. They were proving that in conflicts where identity is ambiguous and enemies hide among civilians, the advantage goes to those who control perception. The weapon they carried wasn't primarily the suppressed rifle or the captured AK-47. It wasn't the radio that could call in artillery or the knife that could silently eliminate sentries. The deadliest weapon was the black pajamas on their backs, the conical hat, the tire rubber sandals, the appearance that made them visually indistinguishable from the enemy. Identity had become weaponized. Perception had become the battlefield. They made the enemy doubt their own eyes. They made friendly forces question what they saw. They operated in the cognitive space between recognition and identification. In that split second, where the brain processes visual information and assigns meaning. The human cost was real and lasting. Many operators never spoke of their experiences after returning home. The psychological weight of operating under dual threat, where enemy and friendly forces both posed lethal danger, created trauma that conventional veterans didn't face. Post-traumatic stress manifested in unique ways. Survivors carried memories of near misses with friendly fire that were as vivid as enemy contacts. The ones who didn't make it, killed in action operating behind enemy lines, are remembered. Their names are on memorials. Their sacrifice bought the tactical advantages that saved others. The price paid for innovation was measured in psychological scars and lives lost. The final reflection returns to the core truth these operators proved. In conflicts where the enemy looks like anyone, where villages contain both friends and foes, where tunnel networks connect invisible worlds, the advantage goes to those who control perception. The Australian SAS proved this principle in Vietnam's jungles through operations that required courage beyond normal combat. They walked into enemy territory wearing enemy faces. They became the ghosts that haunted VC nightmares. They survived by making themselves indistinguishable from those hunting them. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is to look like a coward. Sometimes the best disguise is truth worn backward. Sometimes the deadliest weapon is the one that makes you invisible. The men who wore black pajamas into enemy territory understood this. They lived it. And modern warriors still walk in their footsteps, wearing enemy faces, becoming ghosts on battlefields across the world. If you found this story fascinating, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold military history. Drop a comment below telling us what other secret tactics you want us to uncover. What other ghost operations from history should we explore next?